Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zach Spilner. I'm the Client Services Manager at Vaya Group. I'll be serving as your moderator and timekeeper today. We're really excited to host a practical, story-driven conversation on what it takes for next generation leaders to succeed. This is going to be grounded in real business experience from Constellation Brands, as well as what leadership research has to say. I have two individuals joining me today, Garth Hankinson, CFO of Constellation Brands, and Michael Vihil, Managing Consultant with Vaya Group. You're going to hear from both of them in just a moment. But before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we've intentionally reserved time near the end for live audience Q&A. Please drop questions into the Q&A feature at any point during the session. I'll be monitoring those and directing them to Michael and Garth. Second, this session is being recorded, as I mentioned. Following the webinar, we're going to send out a link to the recording along with several leadership resources mentioned today, so you can revisit, share as needed as well. With that, Michael, I'm going to turn things over to you to get things kicked off.
All right, Zach, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As Zach mentioned, please do share this. It's a really interesting set of topics we're going to get into. And we're going to be borrowing Marshall Goldsmith's classic insight that what got us here will not get us there. That's really going to frame our whole discussion today. So if what got us here won't get us there, the real question is, what needs to change? So through my work with Vaya Group, I've had the privilege of partnering with Constellation Brands and Garth and several other key stakeholders. The company behind iconic beer brands like Corona, Modelo, as well as premium wine and spirits brands, including the Prisoner Wine Company and High West Whiskey, among others. I'm really excited to have you, Garth, join us today for this conversation. Before we dive in, I want to give you a quick roadmap for where we're headed in this conversation. The core idea behind today's webinar is simple. The leadership capabilities that helped most of us succeed in the past are no longer sufficient on their own. The pace, pressure, and complexity of today's environment demand a different leadership toolkit, especially for the next generation of leaders. So we're going to be walking you through 5 mission-critical capabilities that we consistently see separating leaders who struggle from leaders who thrive. And we'll ground each one in real business experience, not just theory. First up will be leadership agility. Not agility like moving fast, but the kind of agility needed to figure out what to do when you and others aren't quite sure what to do. Agility helps with ambiguity. Storytelling will be next. During times of complexity, data alone isn't enough. Leaders have to be sense makers, helping people understand what's changing, why it matters, and where we're going. So storytelling is how strategy becomes real and how change actually moves through an organization. Third up will be relational intelligence. Work today is deeply cross-functional and interdependent. Leaders succeed less through authority and more through trust, influence, and relationships, especially across silos. Fourth will be psychological safety. You can't be agile or innovative if people are afraid to speak up. So psychological safety isn't about being just nice or lowering standards. It's about creating the conditions where people can raise their concerns, challenge ideas, and learn quickly without fear. Finally, we'll touch upon resilience. Leadership today is a stamina sport. The best leaders aren't the ones who never get knocked down. They're the ones who recover quickly. They learn from setbacks and sustain performance over time. This is where the leader as athlete mindset really comes into play. We'll take these one at a time. Garth will share what he sees at Constellation Brands from his seat, and I'll add some framing or research along the way. Let's start with leadership agility, because in many ways, it's the foundation for everything we're going to be talking about today. I had the opportunity earlier in my career to partner with Vicky Swisher, who quite literally wrote the book on leadership agility. The way she and the research defined agility really stayed with me. Leadership agility isn't about moving fast. It's about how skilled you are at figuring out what to do when others, yourself included, might not know what to do. That's the reality leaders are facing more and more often. And the research on this topic breaks agility into four very practical dimensions. We've got mental agility, making meaning out of chaos; people agility, working with all walks of life at all levels across the enterprise; results agility, getting things done with a future centric attitude; and finally, change agility, navigating the change with openness and curiosity. So, Garth, from your perspective, how do you see this needing to show up maybe now more than ever before at Constellation Brands?
Well, thanks for the question. And before I answer it, Michael, I just want to say thanks to you and Zach for, including me today. I look forward to the next 45 minutes with you and the others on this call, and I really look forward to some of the Q&A that hopefully we get towards the end. You laid out a lot there in terms of what falls under agility, Michael, and for us at Constellation, I would say, we kind of define agility is having the willingness and the ability to recognize the need to think and act differently. And if we think about that in the context of what all of us have experienced over the last few years, I think you kind of see the need for that and the importance of that. In the last handful of years, we've had to manage through a global pandemic, right? Coming out of a pandemic, we then had to manage through interruptions to supply chains that hit every sort of sector of our economy. That then resulted, for a lot of factors, in increased inflationary pressures, increased interest rate environment, and increased unemployment. And as a result, I think companies like ourselves have had to rethink what our standard operating procedures are and what our playbook is. We've had to have a willingness to consider taking actions that in the past, we wouldn't take. Whether that is around how we think about our pricing architecture, whether that's how we think about the packages that we offer for consumers and the price points in which we can hit with those packages to ensure that all of our consumers can find our products regardless of what their economic condition is. We've even had to rethink how we communicate with consumers as the consumer has evolved, particularly this younger cohort, around what their path to purchase is, being much less linear in nature and much more sort of a meandering path to purchase. And so I think as an organization, we've hit that head on, and I think you've seen us take a lot of actions, particularly over the last 12 months, on really things that show an evolution in our playbook. It's not a revolution, right? Because we still need to make sure that we're creating and maintaining the strong brand equities that we have, that particularly for those brands you mentioned, at the outset. But we also can't be sort of, naive to think that, everything that we did in the past will result in us continue to be successful in the future.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. I mean, and I know, Garth, from my conversations, not only with you, but other executive management committee members, people both in the beer business, wine and spirits business, and so many others. And you mentioned, this playbook is really changing. And the ability to at the same time honor your deep roots, right? You've got a huge heritage, right? You have that old scorecard playbook that needs to somehow stay in place while it's evolving. And that's the definition of this agility tool, right? That we're talking about, leadership agility. Where do you see that leaders are needing to be able to figure out things with the playbook isn't clear the most in your company?
I do think it's how we interact with consumers, particularly as, the older, reliable baby boomer cohort sort of becomes less of the overall sort of beverage alcohol pie, and the younger consumer becomes bigger. Again, it's a different path to purchase. They have different points of view on what premiumization is and what that value proposition is. They have differences in how they consume media. and who they trust when it comes to uh, suggestions for products to purchase. And we even know that they have different, taste profile. So
Yeah.
I think that that's really where, we've needed to be agile, as you say, anchored in our past, anchored in the heritage of our brands, but also receptive to, the consumer and meeting the consumer where they're at.
Completely. And I see, in our line of business, and certainly speaking on behalf of Vaya Group, we see that across many industries, Garth, right? So many organizations are going through the same trade winds, economics, politics, consumer preferences, and on and on and on. And so, that tricky balancing act of honoring your deep roots, your heritage, where you all came from, with in a parallel process, seeing that, again, like we opened, what got you here won't get you there. Part of agility, that I outlined there, that change agility, navigating through the changes with openness and curiosity. Can you speak to that just a little bit about the big changes Constellation Brands are going through right now?
Yeah, so on this, as you think about that change management, one of the things that we've learned over the years is that there's nothing more critical, regardless of what the change is, right? And than proper change management, right? It doesn't matter whether you're putting in a new ERP system across the enterprise. Doesn't matter if it's just new, people processes. If you don't get buy-in, if you don't, give people a story for where you are and where you're going and why, right? People will be resistant to change. And I think that that's absolutely something that, as I say, we've learned over time, and why whenever we're, taking on a new endeavor inside of Constellation, the change management, management portion of that conversation is always front of mind. We're always very, very intentional around how we think about change management, how we include them in the process. When I say them, we have a team that helps, an internal team that helps us through change management, and making sure that our change management team is involved early in projects, so that they are best able to help us manage through the change that we're trying to, instill in the organization.
Mm-hmm. It does take a village, right? It really does take a group of people, like you said. So, one thing that becomes clear with leadership agility is that figuring out things isn't enough. Leaders have to help other people make sense of what's happening with all of those changes, right? So, this is where storytelling comes into place. And not storytelling like marketing storytelling, but storytelling in terms of sense making. The research on leadership communication shows that with complex environments, when the path forward isn't obvious, people look to their leaders for meaning, not just information. So great leaders use narrative storytelling to answer 4 questions that their teams are always asking, and unfortunately, often silently asking. 1, what's changing? 2, why does this matter? 3, what are we doing about it? And of course, 4, what does this mean for me and my role? Really important questions. Data tells people what's happening. Storytelling helps people understand the so what and the now what. Garth, when we first met, I recall distinctly you referenced in that meeting that the next gen leaders will have to be better storytellers. Please tell us all what you meant and say much more about that topic.
Yeah, so when you bring up storytelling, it actually reminds me of an article I read a couple of years ago. And in that article, I think it was David Solomon, who's the CEO of Goldman Sachs, was quoted that there's really a need for more liberal arts majors in the world, which, by the way, makes me feel good because I was a liberal arts major in undergrad. But his point on that is that we train people to do all the analytics that you referenced, Michael. But where we often fall short in business is having people who can either verbally or in written form communicate well and tell stories, right? To be able to take that data, to be able to take that information and turn it into something that's actually actionable. And to me, that's really critical, because if you can take that data and you can create those stories, you begin to almost democratize decision making and solution generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of a single leader having to sit back and sift through the data and sift through the information and kind of come up with a story and then a solution, when more people are provided what the insights are and get to that core truth, the greater opportunity it is for people to weigh in on how do you address concerns, how do you best to move forward as an organization, and how do you think through potential pitfalls.
And it's reminding me so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Garth, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what you are saying reminds me so much. We often hear, in our line of business, leadership advisory, coaching, consulting, that leaders need to speak to the minds and hearts of people, right? And so I think we're getting at that heart part, right? Not just speaking to their minds, but what's underneath that. And like one of those 4 questions were, why? Most people are so hungry for leaders to articulate the big purpose behind the picture. And that's a critical part of storytelling.
Oh, absolutely. That storytelling and that why, that really unlocks the organization, in my opinion, by providing clarity, right? And as a result of providing that clarity, then unlocks the ability to take action.
Yeah, for sure. I want to flip this over a little bit. We haven't talked yet about the shadow side of some of this. So when you think of storytelling at Constellation Brands, what can really work against that? What's the dark side? What is it like, for example, when people are doing the opposite of storytelling?
Well, I think to your point on the shadow piece, I mean, if you're not doing shadow, if you're not effectively storytelling, right, and basing that storytelling on information and on data, then what you're doing is, you're creating an environment where everybody is interpreting that data, that information on their own, right? And that can lead to sort of organizational dysfunction. I think it could lead to organizational gridlock, right? Because now you have dueling points of view. And to me, that's the darkest side. And when you have dueling points of view, it's hard to get consensus to move forward. And that can paralyze you.
Absolutely. And then, not only can it paralyze you and others, that really has a lot of negative implications for the climate of the company, the culture of the company, decreasing having a competitive advantage in the marketplace. There's a lot of things that are unintended consequences, I'll put it that way, when leaders aren't leaning into being a better storyteller.
Yeah.
Let's move forward, because what's interesting about storytelling is that even the best story doesn't land unless there's trust. So that takes us directly into relational intelligence as a topic. Most people are really familiar by now with Daniel Goleman and all of his amazing work on emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, social skills, the 4 cornerstones of that. But what we've learned over time is that those same capabilities don't just live inside individuals, they play out between people relationally, right? So that's the genesis of relational intelligence. Relational intelligence takes EI and expands it beyond self-management to include how leaders build trust, how they tune into others, how they adapt across differences, and how they influence without relying on authority. So relationally intelligent leaders are aware of the impact they're having on others and the impact others are having on them. They're curious about others' perspectives. And like you said, they're intentional about investing in trust before they need it. At Constellation Brands, in your seat, perhaps even in your industry, Garth, can you speak to why relational intelligence can make such a big difference today, especially as work becomes much more cross-functional, interconnected, and global?
Yeah, so this is a really critical part or point I think you're making, Michael. And when I answer your question, I'll do it really in the context of inside of Constellation Brands. And for us, and I think many large organizations, relationships really are what gets things done. And this actually hits really close to home for me right now, because we had a leader here who was a very skilled thought leader, very strategic in orientation, could see where we were today, where we are today, and could see where we needed to get to in 3, 4, 5 years, and had a good sort of map for how we would tactically get here. But unfortunately, everything that you just mentioned, right? That EQ, that emotional intelligence, the ability to create relationships, wasn't necessarily a strength. And so organizational resistance, came into play, right? Even from other, leaders, there was a question as to, well, why are we doing what we do? And why do we do it? Why do we have to do it now? Why do we have to do it in this way? For those people who are going to be impacted by the actual change in process or the change in systems or whatever it was going to take to get us there, there was a lack of clarity for the why and the why now. And so when I think about, building relationships, not to rely on too many, sort of quotes, if you will, but it also reminds me of an old quote from Tip O'Neill, which is, all politics are local. When I think about leaders who are trying to lead and drive change, they have to understand that everybody who's involved in that, and there are going to be dozens of people, no matter what the change is, there are going to be dozens and dozens of people involved. And those people want to know, how is this impacting me? Why is this impacting me? Will I have to do my job differently? Will I have a job at all? And you have to take that time. You're right. You have to take that time to collaborate and communicate. And importantly, when you think about communication, it's not just telling a clear story or providing a clear vision. It's actively listening, right? So that people not only feel heard, but they are heard, right?
Yes.
And that you can course correct if need be, or at least be empathetic to the concerns. So, like I say, this it's home very close to me because we've lived through this, and we've got a different leader in place in this particular function and time, and this is someone who, in short order, has kind of come in and really been that high EQ leader, and has moved us farther forward faster than what his predecessor did, and it's all just based on strong EQ skills.
I like that. Farther, forward, faster. Say that 3 times really fast.
Yeah, I struggle with that. You could tell.
It is so important, and I know for a fact, Garth, that specifically at Constellation Brands, in speaking with so many of your colleagues, so many of those EMC members and others, I can't tell you how many times, even though we rattled off earlier, the beers and the wines and the whiskeys and this and that, how many times I've heard that actually we at Constellation Brands are in the relationship building business.
We are.
Help people understand, because I've heard that from other industries as well. They're selling a luxury retail good, but they say, we're in the relationship building. I remember many years ago working with JP Morgan, and they too said, we're in the relationship building business. Can you speak to that even more, and also more globally these days with everything going on in Mexico versus the US versus elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, look, for us, I mean, it's really in every part of the business. You mentioned a couple. I can hit on those, but I can mention a few others. I mean, we have a bit of a uniqueness here in beverage alcohol, where we have to operate under what we call the 3-tier system. We have to sell. By law, we have to sell to third-party distributors, who then sell to retailers, who then sell to consumers, right? So, we have to build really strong relationships with our distributor partners, because they are who then interact with the retailers, right? And we need to make sure that our distributor partners are have a strong relationship with our retail partners, because they are the ones who ultimately then, speak to our consumer. or most closely speak to our consumers. Obviously, we do that ourselves through, media and things of that nature, but we need to rely on others as much as we rely on ourselves. And that requires, very, very strong relationship building and nurturing. You mentioned a couple others in today's, day and age, those government relationships, and we operate very, very heavily in the U.S. and in Mexico. So nurturing those relationships as you're thinking through, how do we expand the business? Where do we expand the business? Where are we going to place our investment dollars? How do we address concerns of this policymaker or that policymaker? And what we've learned, not surprisingly, is when you have a strong relationship, particularly in this field, you can break through the rhetoric and get down to like what is the root issue we're trying to solve for, and what is the outcome that will work best for you, and what you're looking to achieve, and then what's the best outcome for us, and then you can find a way, to meet in the middle, hopefully. And I think, we've been relatively successful in that, over the course of the last, few years as we've managed through some of these challenging times that we discussed at the outset, in terms of disruptions in supply chains and global pandemics and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. And, when we zoom out, strong relationships aren't just about collaborating a little bit more effectively. They're also about making it safe for people to speak up. And that takes us directly to psychological safety. If there is one place to go on the topic of psychological safety, it's Amy Edmondson's seminal work. She's really the thought guru on this topic of psychological safety. I know Edmondson defines psychological safety as a climate or culture where people believe they can speak up, ask for help, admit mistakes, and challenge ideas without fear of embarrassment or retribution. It's not about being nice. It's also not about lowering your standards. And it's not about avoiding hard conversations either. In fact, the latest research shows that the healthiest climates and cultures combine high psychological safety with high accountability. The research shows that when people feel safe, learning speeds up, problems surface earlier, and creativity and innovation both increase. And then the flip side, maybe more important, when psychological safety is low or not even there, people go quiet, risks stay hidden, and teams end up in survival mode rather than learning mode. So Garth, over at Constellation Brands, how is this concept of psychological safety becoming part of the climate and culture? And can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I'll maybe even just take you on my own little journey here around how I came to realize how important this is. And I'll say that at Constellation, I think we've always had an environment that was that provided psychological safety. But as an individual, I maybe didn't really internalize that, right? And so, in a prior role where I had responsibility for, a discrete set of activities, I had this mindset that I owned it. It was my responsibility to come up with the solutions. It was my responsibility to bring something to resolution. And, I remember at times feeling an awful amount of stress. Like I'm at a point where I don't know what is the right thing to do here, right? Is it, going through, door number one, or is it going through door number two? And the first time that I encountered this, it was really hard for me to seek out somebody's advice or counsel. And so, I carried, that stress. But after a time or two, you just realize like, and it's probably a little bit by happenstance. You're at that stuck point, and now you're facing a deadline. You're like, okay, I've got no choice but to seek out someone else's guidance and someone else's opinion. And the first time I did that, I realized how freeing that is, right? It frees me up from the stress I'm carrying. It actually even frees up your own thought process. Sometimes just saying it out loud helps someone identify what the solution is. But even if you don't come to that solution on your own, you've now incorporated more people with different points of view and different, different, a different set of contexts, if you will. And what you're doing, right, is you're now, when it gets into those tough spots, you're turning the solution into teamwork, right? It's not an individual's responsibility to resolve all the tough issues. You turn that into teamwork. And as a result, I can promise you the outcomes are better, right? The outcomes are
100%.
better.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, by the way, because that's such a great example of, I think so many of us can relate. I certainly was relating to that, in our careers where we make assumptions, and perhaps also where maybe some of that is coming from not feeling that there is a lot of psychological safety to speak up or ask that question or take that risk. And so we then ricochet into, okay, I guess it's me. I guess I have to do this. This must be my responsibility. That can often surface when there is a lower level of psychological safety embedded in the company's culture and climate. So it's almost like a clue to look for, right, for our audience. If you're seeing that with yourself, if you're tuning into that with others, it might be a sign that perhaps your culture and climate needs more psychological safety. And you mentioned it, it's about others, right? Psychological safety gets co-created. It's not an individual endeavor. So
Yeah,
thank you for sharing that. Go ahead.
and to use a word we've already used before, but we're really intentional about this now. You've referenced our EMC meetings. It's we do this at our EMC meetings. We do this, we do this in my leadership meetings where that is our mantra. Like let's turn this into a team sport. Let's not withhold any information. Let's not hold back any opinions. Let's put all of our cards on the table and turn this decision into a team sport.
Great. That's really capturing it so well. When people feel safe to speak up and learn, the next question becomes, how do leaders then sustain that performance over time, especially when the pressure doesn't let up? And that's where resilience, the leader as athlete mindset, comes into focus. And a lot of the modern thinking here connects directly to Carol Dweck and her research. I don't know if you or anyone out there knows her book. Dr. Carol Dweck wrote the book called Mindset. Run, don't walk. Go get this book. It's phenomenal. In it, Dweck distinguishes between a fixed mindset, where people see ability as something you either have or you don't, versus a growth mindset, where ability is seen as something you can develop through effort, through learning, through mistakes, and through feedback. The research shows that people with a growth mindset don't avoid challenges, they use them. And if you're tuning into the Olympics, that's exactly what elite athletes do. And that's how they think. They expect adversity, right? Then they recover quickly and they re-enter the game with learning, not self-blame. So I'm so curious, Garth, you mentioned early on when we first met this notion that the next gen leaders at Constellation Brands need to be more like athletes and be more resilient. Can you please share more about that with our audience?
Yeah, well, look, and you kind of referenced this in one of the earlier topics we were talking around, this resiliency and people don't really, there's that old adage where, people won't remember your failures, but they will remember how you responded to failure, right? And I think that really speaks to how, we think about resiliency here, at Constellation is we know there's going to be setbacks, right? And yet, even in the face of those setbacks, we know that we still need to continue to perform at a high level. We need to continue to win in the marketplace. We need to be able to continue to meet the expectations of all of our stakeholders, whether that's employees or shareholders or debt holders or whoever they might be, right? And so, we have to be willing to, put any sort of speed bump behind us and find a way to continue to win. And in that regard, what you and I were talking about around this athlete mindset is we need more people in our organization who can think across all disciplines in the organization, all aspects of business, so that it's just not finance people who are coming up with finance solutions, but, a finance person is thinking about the impact of this decision in operations, in sales, or in marketing. And we need more of that, because the more that we have of that, the more resilient we can be. The more opportunity we have to identify, what led to a particular shortfall, what led to a particular speed bump, and then how do we get ourselves out of that? How do we respond to that? And so that's kind of what we mean by, athletes. We want people who have that broad vision. They're not just single subject matter experts, but have the ability to be a global thinker.
And thinking more holistically, you referenced it, thinking less from an I perspective and more from a we, our shared goals. It's our company. And to think more globally, thinking more cross-culturally, to have more awareness there. And to approach things from more of that enterprise-wide perspective, which I know we've been talking a lot about with Constellation Brands leaders.
Oh, that's absolutely the case.
So I am imagining, Zach, that with all of this conversation, we've got some questions, and we've really been talking about a different leadership model for a very different environment, right? So, Zach, what are people curious about?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here that I'd like to share. One goes back to the conversation around storytelling. And so, Michael, I'd like to pose this to you. There was a question an individual asked about how to sound authentic, and I think you mentioned this actually before we get started. So, what's one simple way a leader can use storytelling to create buy-in without sounding scripted? Maintaining that voice and sounding authentic.
It is such a great question. And I have got to tell you, in my 20 years of doing this kind of work, especially in the executive coaching context with senior leaders, that is the number one question I always get. People understand what they need to do differently, but then they add this extra layer of, oh, and I want it to come off as authentic. I want it to be real. Be careful with that question, is what I would say. I encourage those that I'm advising and people that I'm coaching to let yourself practice what it's like behaviorally to tell that story, even if it's scripted, even if you need some new words and a couple of new talking points. Don't have this added extra pressure on top of that in addition to doing that, it better come off as authentic. Let it be more okay for you as a leader, I would say, and for all of us, to have that initial phase be a little awkward. You're learning, you're doing something different, you're trying out new ways to articulate something, to speak to their heads and minds, and it might not sound the most authentic on your first pass. That's okay. You get to tell people openly and transparently, you're working on this, you're learning. And as I've seen, both in my own experience and with those that I've helped, authenticity and a sense of realness, that comes later, after it's been integrated into your repertoire of skills.
Garth, I want to also ask you a question. We were talking about psychological safety, and we got a couple of questions here that are around this topic. For a leader who feels that their team is afraid to speak up, even if they've maybe stated they're open to feedback, publicly, but you get the sense as a leader they're maybe afraid to be completely transparent or honest. What do you suggest a leader do in those situations?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a few things. One is hopefully there are a lot of leaders like that. A lot of leaders who can read the room and read individuals. That's a very good leadership quality in my opinion. I think that oftentimes when people don't feel that psychological safety, it can be a combination of things. Some people just aren't comfortable speaking up in larger groups. Some people might be unsure of their opinion, even if they do want to bring it up. And so for me, I think, one thing to do is to meet with that person kind of one-on-one, and do it in a way that obviously comes across very much from a safety perspective. I know that that's something that I do. I can tell when there are people that just I either know them because of their personality, or I can read it in their face. And usually when you go up to somebody one-on-one, they're willing to really let their thoughts flow. So that's one thing I would do. The second I would do is, even in those group settings, I would keep asking the questions, right? I would make sure that every time you're together, you're leading from a position of showing that you want input, right? That you want questions, you want people, air concerns. I think that's good. Having that psychological safety is good both for the leader and for the people that they're leading, right? And so I think keeping that part of your repertoire is so important. Leaders sometimes get stuck in their own echo chamber, if you will, right? And so we need to hear from everybody in the organization when they have concerns or they question a decision or whatever it is. So I would say keep at it, make it part of your muscle, part of the routine, but also meet people where they're at. And in many instances, that means a one-on-one conversation.
100%. Garth, that is the best advice I've heard. And I would underscore a couple of things, because we see that as well in our research, exactly what you're saying. One of the best things that a leader in that instance could do is to role model right there live what it is to be open and transparent, and to, as you said, Garth, right, tune in and read the room. You're aware that just because you ask the question, people aren't initially answering, right? They're not speaking up. So one of the techniques I've learned over the years, and I will often share this with leaders that I'm helping, is we forget sometimes as people, let alone leaders, that we can just state the obvious. It's a great technique to state the obvious. It means the leader in that moment can really say, hey, team, I'm just tuning into the fact that not everybody's speaking, or why did it just go quiet? And can we talk about that, right? Can we talk about the process of how we're working together? Because here's what I'm noticing, right? So I love this idea when Garth is saying, if it's that individual person, absolutely find some time one-on-one, make it a safe space, share your observations. I would say, number two, make no assumptions. It's very easy for all of us to assume all sorts of things in that scenario, right? We're convinced we know why that person isn't speaking. Be careful, check your assumptions. I have seen so many times personally and with leaders that their assumption was not exactly what was going on, right? So you get to ask, you get to show that curiosity, you get to ask that open-ended question, right? I've noticed this. Can you share what's going on? What would make it better for you to speak up? Is there something I, as the leader, can do less of or more of? Right? That you get into that kind of conversation. It's a great question.
Well, I think from a time perspective, unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the Q&A. But first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for the thoughtful questions. Michael and Garth, I want to thank you both also for such a practical and candid conversation. A couple of reminders. This session has been recorded, so we'll be sending out a follow-up email. That's going to include a link to the recording, the leadership resources that we've mentioned today as well, and then ways to continue the conversation and keep the conversation going. So if today's discussion resonated with you, I would say, and you'd like to explore how building these capabilities within your own leaders or organization, we'd love to connect, and our contact information is going to be shared in the chat as well. So on behalf of Vaya Group and on behalf of Garth as well, I want to thank you all for spending time with us today. We appreciate the engagement and look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Zach. Thank you, Garth, especially. What a pleasure to partner with you. Here's to maybe some future conversations like this. And yeah, if you're not sharing the conversation with us, everyone out there, share it with your own team, with your own company. And so thank you again. Thank you so much, Zach, for moderating and helping us get through this in a timely way. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day.